All right, update. As we reported at the top of the show, federal judge in California today issued a blistering ruling from the bench in which he ordered the Trump administration to rehire thousands of people they had fired from the federal government at USDA, Defense Department, Energy Department, Department of the Interior, the Treasury, and the VA. Well, I got two updates for you. Because tonight, just as we were coming on the air, the plaintiffs in that case, the California federal case, the plaintiffs are the union representing government workers. Plaintiffs went back to that same judge in California and essentially said, thank you for this ruling today, Your Honor. Can you please make it so it applies to even more agencies? They have now formally asked the judge to expand that order today to also order the reinstatement of fired employees at the Commerce Department, Education Department, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, Housing and Urban Development, the Justice Department, Department of Transportation, the EPA, NASA, the National Science Foundation, and the Small Business Administration. Update one. Here's update two. Just minutes after those plaintiffs asked the California federal judge to expand his ruling and order even more agencies to rehire even more people, a second federal judge across the country in Maryland issued a ruling in an entirely separate case ordering the federal government also to rehire thousands of fired federal employees. This federal judge in Maryland tonight has just ordered that thousands of fired probationary employees must now be reinstated at, ready for the list? Department of Agriculture, Department of Commerce, Department of Defense, Department of Education, Department of Energy, Health and Human Services, Homeland Security, Housing and Urban Development, Department of the Interior, Department of Labor, Department of Transportation, the Treasury Department, VA, USAID, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the EPA, the FDIC, the General Services Administration, the Office of Personnel Management, the Small Business Administration, and the National Archives and Records Administration. All of them. Reinstate all of your fired probationary employees. And if it seems like there's overlap between the list in those two cases, you are correct. As of tonight, just in today's news, we've got overlapping federal rulings ordering the immediate reinstatement of thousands of employees at multiple federal agencies. I'll tell you, the Maryland judge writes in this new order that's just out tonight, quote, the law is clear that when dismissing an employee due to unsatisfactory performance, the employer must honestly be dissatisfied with the probationer's conduct or performance after giving him a fair trial on the job. But again, two federal judges tonight with equally sweeping rulings, both in the same direction, both telling Trump, when you fired those people, you had no right. Give them back their jobs. Watch this space.
What the conservative-leaning Wall Street Journal has called the, quote, dumbest trade war in history has put Republican elected officials between a rock and a hard place, politically speaking. The problem stemming entirely from their relentless blind loyalty to Donald Trump and all of his inane policies. On one side, a president who lives on Earth 2, seemingly undeterred by the damage his tariffs are doing to the American people and the American economy. Undeterred by the markets tanking again, the Dow falling about 500 points today. Donald Trump today threatening to put everyone's favorite bottle of wine out of reach for most people's budget, threatening a 200% tariff on wine and liquor imported from Europe. That is in response to a retaliatory tariff from the European Union. Tariffs on steel and aluminum imported from anywhere in the world went into effect last night. Trump telling Americans, we don't need that stuff Canada sells.
We don't need their lumber. We don't need their energy. We have more than they do. We don't need anything. We don't need their cars. I'd much rather make the cars here. And there's not a thing that we need. Now, there'll be a little disruption, but it won't be very long. But they need us. We really don't need them. And we have to do this. I'm sorry. We have to do this.
Said no one. The United States imports 30% of our lumber from abroad, mainly from Canada. 60% of the oil that runs through American refineries is from abroad, again, mostly from Canada. And Canada is the third largest source of cars that are imported in America by Americans. According to Trump, we don't need you, Canada. It's squeezing Republicans on the other side of Trump because their constituents live in reality and the basic facts of life and the laws of economics. and angry and frustrated American voters who had been promised by Donald Trump and those Republicans that the price of everything would go down. Businesses from Best Buy to Target to major airlines are warning that the cost of tariffs and a weakening economy are going to hit hard. One Wall Streeter telling Reuters this, quote, "A market that was cruising has been disrupted by the White House. The volatility is in part caused by the market's uncertainty as to what the administration's objectives are. Why are we going after Canada exactly?" According to Trump administration officials, people like the Agriculture Secretary Brooke Rollins of Get a Chicken If You Think Egg Prices Are Too High fame, it's all part of their plan. Listen.
You have J.P. Morgan now saying a recession is up to a 40% possibility. So what is it? Is it Hassett and Gasparino, or is it Jamie Dimon at J.P. Morgan?
Well, first of all, good morning, and thanks. Great to be with you on this beautiful day here at the White House. Listen, the bottom line is this: no one really knows. I think what's really telling is the president is so focused on not the short term, which, as we all know, in politics, everyone's always worried about the short term. He truly wants to fix America.
Short-term pain for whatever she's talking about in the long term was never any part of what Donald Trump promised the voters.
Starting on day one, we will end inflation and make America affordable again. We'll do that. We've got to bring it down. Starting on day one, we will end inflation and make America affordable again. Starting on day one of my new administration, we will end inflation and we will make America affordable again. It's not affordable. So when I win, I will immediately bring prices down. I will instruct my cabinet that I expect results within the first 100 days or much sooner than that. I would say the first 7 days is fine.
It was in every speech. It was usually the biggest applause line. Every day, everywhere he went. Day one. Now, the yawning gap between what Trump promised as a candidate and what he's doing as a president is starting to cause heartburn among Republican electeds. Senator Mike Rounds tells NBC News this, quote, "Look, this isn't the way I would do it. I think they want to try something different than from the previous administration, but they've got to show some success fairly quickly." Kentucky Senator Rand Paul tells NBC News this, quote, "There are stories coming out talking about cars costing $10,000 more. And of course, we are worried about bourbon. We want to sell our bourbon. The Canadians are going to block our bourbon." Now that you add lumber costs to that and steel with tariffs, nobody at home is coming up to me and saying, please put the tariffs on. Over in the House, stuck between Donald Trump and his unpopular agenda and their own voters, Republicans are doing everything and anything they can to avoid the subject. New York Times reports this, quote, "House Democrats had planned to force a vote on resolutions to end the tariffs on Mexico and Canada, a move allowed under the National Emergencies Act, which provides a mechanism for Congress to terminate an emergency like the one Trump declared when he imposed the tariffs on February 1st. But Republican leaders on Tuesday slipped language into a procedural measure that would prevent any resolution to end the tariffs on Mexico, Canada, and China from receiving a vote this year. They did so using a particularly unusual contortion. They essentially declared the rest of the year one long day, nullifying a law that allows the House and Senate to jointly put an end to a disaster declared by the president. But whatever gobbledygook they try to do procedurally, Republicans cannot outrun what people are feeling from a flagging economy or policies that threaten to raise the cost of living immediately, especially when it comes months after an election in which the price of things were the deciding factor for millions of voters. One strategist telling NBC News this, quote, "At some point, members of Congress start going into full freakout mode." That's where we start today with some of our favorite reporters and friends. Anchor and correspondent for Bloomberg News, David Gura, joins us from Quebec, site of a G7 meeting of finance ministers. Also joining us, Martina Stevens-Gridneff, Canada bureau chief for the New York Times, and our friend, former Republican congressman and MSNBC political analyst David Jolly is here. David Gura, you start. More insults and more threats for Canada today from Donald Trump.
Yeah, it's astonishing. You know, you look at what Secretary of State Marco Rubio said on his way here. He was asked what he thought the reception would be when he got here, and he said, this isn't a meeting about how we're going to take over Canada. He said that in reply to a reporter. And in fact, that's not what's on the agenda here. There is a lot that is. Certainly what's going on in Ukraine and Russia is high up there. But everyone here is talking about and acutely aware of the fact that this trade war that was started just a few weeks ago continues to escalate. And Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, was on Bloomberg this morning, and he was asked about the ratcheting up of these tariffs over these last few days. And he said, if you make Donald Trump unhappy, he's going to react unhappy. So just an insight into kind of the mercurial behavior of the president when it comes to these tariffs. But as you laid out there, Nicole, at the top, it's having profound effects across the economy and markets as well. We've seen $5 trillion wiped out of the S&P 500 over these last few days. So this is serious business and having serious effects for, yes, for investors, for people across this country, many of whom I think are flummoxed by what's happening here, recognizing the fact that while the president might be talking about a period where there's going to be some transition, it's going to take some time, there's going to be some disruption. It seems like this is very real and that disruption is happening already. Talk of cars becoming more expensive, as you said. What we saw today, the kind of back and forth when it comes to tariffs on American liquor, followed by an even more extreme tariff on champagne and other French wines. These, of course, have a lot of symbolic import. People react to them. You heard Senator Rand Paul reacting to that bourbon tariff, but regular Americans do as well. And I think that what's kind of overlaying all of this is just wonderment about why this is happening and sort of how far this is going to go.
Martina, here is Donald Trump today threatening again to annex Canada as the 51st state.
To be honest with you, Canada only works as a state. It doesn't. We don't need anything they have. As a state, it would be one of the great states anyway. This would be the most incredible country visually. If you look at a map, they drew an artificial line right through it between Canada and the U.S. Just a straight artificial line. Somebody did it a long time ago, many, many decades ago, and makes no sense. It's so perfect as a great and cherished state. Keeping "O Canada," the national anthem. I love it. I think it's great.
I mean, equal parts idiotic and dangerous. What is the reception in Canada when stuff like that comes out of the mouth of an American president sitting inside the Oval Office?
So I think people are taking this stuff really seriously, and they're very concerned about it. I don't think they take it as a joke or even as a joke gone bad. Frankly, you know, people point out that all borders are man-made and in some way artificial, and many of them are relatively recent as the world came together to separate in different countries. But I think what people are finding most menacing is that this is coming from a friend, a NATO ally, an economic partner, you know, a next door neighbor. And so I think we're past the point of wondering whether this is a joke or not. I think Canadian officials and society are taking it extremely seriously, and we're seeing the impact it's having across the board in the economy and society and in Canadian politics.
I interviewed Premier Doug Ford, and he seemed to be girding for holding the line and for meeting toughness with toughness. Is that the view? I mean, is that representative of the mindset of the Canadian people and the majority of Canadian politicians?
Sure. Doug Ford, Captain Canada, of course, as a premier, he doesn't make federal policy, and he would not be the one negotiating a trade deal for Canada. But we are hearing similar lines, you know, in different styles of delivery from incoming Prime Minister Mark Carney, who will be sworn in tomorrow in Ottawa to replace Justin Trudeau. We're even hearing the same kind of language from the opposition leader, the leader of the Conservative Party, Pierre Poilievre. So one thing President Trump's rhetoric and language and actions have done is sort of united the political spectrum of Canada as well as society in a really unprecedented and extraordinary way.
NBC News senior White House correspondent Gabe Gutierrez is joining us from Canada, and our senior business correspondent Christine Roman's here in New York with me. Gabe, key meetings on both sides of the border as this trade war escalates. New threats from President Trump. Where do things stand, and what are we expecting today?
Hi there, Anna. Good morning. Well, yes, this G7 foreign ministers meeting is just getting underway today. We just had that family photo, as they call it, here with Foreign Minister, Secretary of State Marco Rubio arriving and already meeting first thing with Canada's foreign minister as well. Certainly very awkward situation here with all these tariff threats looming over this foreign ministers meeting. So far, Secretary Rubio only mentioning, talking about Ukraine. And Russia's war there. And one of the top topics that will be discussed today will also be China and the Indo-Pacific. But really behind closed doors, what we expect is Canadian officials to really ramp up the pressure on the U.S. delegation about this tariff threat. You mentioned just this morning President Trump coming out and posting on social media, calling the EU abusive for its retaliatory tariffs, and now threatening that 200% tariff on alcohol coming from overseas. This is something that is not letting down. And as you said, top Canadian officials will also head down to Washington later today to meet with Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick. So far, we don't have any indication that the White House is backing down from any of this, even though we are hearing from two people familiar with the discussions that there has been some concern about the president's economic council that these tariffs might, that this economic pain might not be so short-lived. But for now, the president does believe that longer term, this will help the U.S. attract manufacturing jobs back to the country. But again, this G7 foreign ministers meeting now underway. Secretary of State Marco Rubio getting an earful from top Canadian and European officials here.
And Gabe, we know you need to get into the meeting so you can continue to report it out. Thank you so much for joining us. Keep us posted. Okay, Christine, let's talk about these new threats on wine and liquor from the European Union. That can't be popular.
No, not popular. But look, let's step back. This started with steel and aluminum. The president put tariffs on steel and aluminum. The EU then turned around and put tariffs on motorcycles and ag goods and beef and whiskey and boats. And now the president is saying, OK, I see you and I raise you a 200% tariff on all of the alcohol coming out of France and out of the EU. So he is escalating here to make the point, I think, that he is in a position to do that and that this is what he is trying to do. He is trying to put up these trade taxes to keep investment, to keep jobs in the U.S. It's really interesting to me. You talk about what he's trying to do here. It could take years to do what he's trying to do. In the very near term, though, quite disruptive for prices and for supply chains.
So years, you're saying, could be the timeline here, not necessarily a short-term pain that we've been hearing from the president and his advisors.
It took 30 or 40 years to get to where we are here. This is all anxiety over NAFTA and trade deals of the 90s that in hindsight looked like they gutted out the American manufacturing job, and returning those American manufacturing jobs. I mean, it took 30 years to lose them. How long will it take to bring that back, if that is really what he has the fortitude to do here? So it's a long-term process.
The market's not liking these latest moves this morning, down again. I feel like it's Groundhog Day. We've been saying this every single day. They don't like uncertainty. Businesses don't like uncertainty. Everyday people don't like uncertainty. But the president continues to defend these tariff, trade war moves, all the back and forth. Listen.
There's been a lot of on and off, some inconsistency.
There's no inconsistency, only with NBC, which is one of the worst networks on television, by the way. Let me just tell you the inconsistency. I have the right to adjust. It's not called inconsistency, it's called flexibility. And I think you want me to be flexible, too.
Is flexibility going to be your ongoing view towards
Sure, I'll always have flexibility, but there will be very little flexibility once we start. April 2nd is going to be a very big day.
That was our Kelly O'Donnell asking questions there. Christine, is that message going to calm investors and entrepreneurs?
Well, one of the things that I hear from business leaders is they don't understand the strategy, even if you understand the end game of sort of reindustrializing the American Midwest and the American heartland. For example, going after Canada, they don't understand why Canada is put in the same kind of footing as Mexico in terms of the drug trade. They also talk about, wait, what is the point here? Is the point to stop drugs? Is the point to bring production back to the U.S.? Is the point to punish other countries? You know, so sometimes the rationale shifts, and that's causes business leaders to wonder, like, what is the strategy here?
There's a moving target.
Exactly. But the president, I think, is adamant about this. And those of us who've covered him for years in, New York before he was, presidential candidate or even talking about the presidency, he has talked about the American auto industry, that he prefers cars to be made in America, right? He likes things made in America. It's almost hearkening back to maybe the 1950s, before these big trade deals changed the face of American manufacturing and that globalization was the end result. And you've heard Scott Bessent, his Treasury Secretary, saying the American dream is not being able to buy cheap stuff. I'm paraphrasing, and he'll be speaking here in a moment with our colleague Sarah Eisen. But, the chasing cheap stuff is sort of what got us here, and they want good jobs. And the president thinks this is the strategy to try to restore that.
Okay, Christine Romans, thank you so much for helping us make sense, or trying to make sense of it all. And joining us now is MSNBC political analyst, former Republican governor of Ohio, John Kasich, and former advisor to the Clinton, Biden, and Harris campaigns, Adrian Elrod, who also served in the Biden administration. So, Governor, the president, we just heard him say that everything will be answered April 2nd, presumably talking about more, quote unquote, reciprocal tariffs. But we still see these dates, these deadlines, they've already shifted so many times. Should Wall Street, automakers, other industries trust him? At what point does this become a case of the boy who cried wolf?
Well, look, here's what drives the economy, Anna, is consumer confidence and consumer buying. And what's happening in so many different ways are people are cutting back. I mean, you're beginning to see it. They're not going to many restaurants. There was an article today about what the CEO of Walmart's had to say. Even the people who are selling the more expensive goods are seeing sort of a pullback. I talked to a person yesterday, a hedge fund guy, who told me that he's beginning to see consumer confidence ebb. Now, if that happens, then you have a problem. And what you have here is the willy-nilly of where it's chaos. It's chaotic, Mm-hmm. Chaos is never. You might remember the television show called Get Smart. I mean, I'm really dating myself, but chaos was the enemy in that show. And there's just too much chaos now. And so people are getting jumpy. And when they get jumpy, they don't want to go out and aggressively spend. And if all of a sudden consumer confidence wanes, as it appears to be doing now, then you're going to have an economy that's going to slow down. And what everybody's concerned about, of course, is, are we headed into a recession? Now, we've had a couple years, 2.5 years of steady growth, Anna, steady growth. And now, you're beginning, is this just a cool-off period? But a lot of it driven by the consumer here in the United States. And this chaos is dampening their enthusiasm for taking risks.
Adrian, take a listen to the Commerce Secretary a short time ago weighing in on all this before today's meeting with Canadians.
The president was totally annoyed that the Europeans did this. And so you're going to hear back from someone who emotionally cares about America. He cares about America, and he wants to take care of Americans. And why are Europeans picking on Kentucky bourbon
Secretary
or
Lutnick,
Harley-Davidson motorcycles?
Are you saying this is an emotional response?
Adrian, what's your reaction to that?
Well, first of all, I just want to say, Anna, Trump's economic team, even amid the chaos of some of the other nominees that he put forward to work in his administration, his economic team was widely acknowledged as a team that had a lot of experience, that was going to help sort of temper Trump on some of these, potentially on some of these tariffs that he wanted to impose. And we are not seeing that happen. You just saw an interview with Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, who was basically saying, Trump is trying to help Americans. This is what he's trying to do. He's trying to help the economy. No, he's not. A couple of things. Governor Kasich just said, we've had 2 years of a strong economy. Yes, inflation costs have been high. They have been going down under the last few months of President Biden's term. Trump inherited a really good economy. All he had to let happen was the infrastructure bill be implemented, the CHIPS and Science Act, which I worked on the implementation of the Department of Commerce, some of these major economic policies that would have brought these manufacturing jobs back to the United States. He just had to sit back and let those jobs come into play, and he could have taken the credit for it. It would have been wrong for him to do that, but knowing Trump, that's what he would have done. Instead, he is causing chaos, and as a result, we are seeing prices go up. We're seeing the checkbooks and retirement accounts of Americans suffer for just the fact that he wants to seek retribution on his political enemies, some of his global enemies, perceived global enemies, I should say, including some of our top allies like Canada and like the EU. So it's just a way for Trump to, again, sow chaos and discord. We are seeing in polling that his economic numbers are underwater. You know, Anna, he is in the goodwill time of being president. He's in the first 2 months of his presidency. It's very rare that you see his president's economic numbers where they are. But Trump, this is all self-imposed on his part.
Christine, let's talk about just the reaction to what we're seeing today, these retaliatory tariffs and the way that they're seemingly very targeted to specific areas and to specific products that are going to affect specific voters in this country.
And these are what trade wars do, right? Think about what happened today when you talk about, for example, a 200% tariff on wine. That's a reaction to a tariff. I mean, so it just starts to escalate and involve more communities, more factories, more products, and it hurts people on, frankly, both sides. And that's what, markets today unsettled as well. Again, 3 weeks of sort of just understanding this is an escalating trade war without an off-ramp. People can't see an off-ramp quite yet. And they know what the president wants to do. He wants to return domestic production to what he sees as a pre-NAFTA glory. But that will be very, very difficult and can take an awful lot of time. And this is a lot of experts say this isn't the way they would go about it in the first place.
There's also questions of whether that can even be achieved. You can even create a golden age for America by making us more nationalistic and by rehoming all these companies. Ben Shapiro was talking to his 7 million podcast listeners saying that this doesn't make any sense. Every country that has attempted this has found themselves in worse economic shape. He mentioned China, he mentioned Russia, and there were a couple of others. There was this also from the New York Times today that I thought was really interesting. This is from David Sanger. This is on the previous tariffs that Donald Trump imposed in 2018. The raft of studies that followed showing that the country lost tens of thousands of jobs, upward of 75,000 jobs by one study in the industries that were dependent on steel and aluminum. So Donald Trump's talking about trying to bring jobs home. The last time he tried this, Catherine, he lost a lot of jobs.
Yes, and that was foreseeable then. It is foreseeable again this time around because there are many more downstream jobs that are dependent on consumption of steel as inputs than there are jobs that are dependent on production of steel. Automakers, appliance makers, all sorts of other manufacturing firms, which Trump also claims to be supporting. Look, the best case scenario for tariffs, the best possible outcome, and I am well known as a tariff skeptic, is that, sure, we pay a little bit more for foreign products, but maybe we increase some manufacturing here and get a few thousand additional manufacturing jobs. But in order for that very narrow outcome to materialize, you need to make sure that you are actually tariffing the right products and the right industries. Instead, we are tariffing things we don't make and raw materials we don't have. So if Trump is, let's say, tariffing energy from Canada, yes, we have plenty of energy here, but not enough to fulfill the needs that our industry needs and that our households and regular consumers need. The same thing with steel, the same thing with lumber. There are potash, which something I never needed to learn about until recently. It's a key ingredient to fertilizer that about 80 to 90% of the fertilizer or the potash that's used here in America by American farmers comes from Canada. Yeah. You can't just replace that. So nothing he is doing is actually making our industry more competitive. If anything, if he raises steel tariffs to 50% on Canada, as he has threatened, it would probably become cheaper to make cars anywhere else in the world besides the United States.
I have so many questions. I'm going to go with this simple one. Do the people in his administration not know what they're doing?
Well, that's a big question. I mean, they are singing from his songbook. I mean, they are now.
But Donald Trump is not an economist.
No, he's not an economist, but he has a worldview that he is absolutely 100% committed to, that tariffs are the 100% the cure to every every problem that ails the United States right now, and he's going to use them. And so they are executing what Trump wants to do.
All right, let's talk about worldviews here, and I'm gonna take us back in time, back to the 1980s. Let me play the one-time scion of the Republican Party, Ronald Reagan, on tariffs.
At first, when someone says, let's impose tariffs on foreign imports, it looks like they're doing the patriotic thing by protecting American products and jobs. And sometimes for a short while it works, but only for a short time. What eventually occurs is, first, homegrown industries start relying on government protection in the form of high tariffs. They stop competing and stop making the innovative management and technological changes they need to succeed in world markets. And then, while all this is going on, something even worse occurs. High tariffs inevitably lead to retaliation by foreign countries and the triggering of fierce trade wars. The result is more and more tariffs, higher and higher trade barriers, and less competition. So soon, because of the prices made artificially high by tariffs that subsidize inefficiency and poor management, people stop buying. Then the worst happens. Markets shrink and collapse, businesses and industries shut down, and millions of people lose their jobs.
Back before there were teleprompters. Charlie, does the Republican Party still believe in that worldview? It was once the only worldview the Republican Party had.
Well, they should believe in that worldview. Ronald Reagan was absolutely right about this. I mean, how hard is this to understand that these tariffs are going to be inflationary? They're going to raise prices. And by the way, tariffs on Mexican produce at this time of year is going to raise food prices. I mean, Canada, how many times do we have to explain that the privileged few will be protected at the expense of the many? Canadian aluminum, is a packaging material in many cases. You wrap a little Hershey Kiss in aluminum foil, beer and soda cans. I mean, this is not hard to understand. As Catherine pointed out, there will be so many more jobs lost in manufacturing in this country that use steel and aluminum and other ingredients and commodities than we will save in the protected industries. This is so basic. It will be so destructive to American manufacturing and agriculture. During Smoot-Hawley, back in 1930, global trade was $3 trillion. It shrank to about $1 trillion. We've been through this before. We've seen these effects. And by the way, in the 1930s, I believe we ran trade surpluses, but nobody seemed to really care because the unemployment rates were around 20%. So that's the problem we're dealing with. We're going back to the 1890s or the 1930s trade policy, which failed.
Yeah. And by the way, Reagan ended that by saying that he remembers the 1930s, and that's why he's in office now, saying that tariffs are a bad idea. But you're in Pennsylvania, Charlie, so speak to your voters there, because a lot of them voted on this idea that Donald Trump was going to fix the economy, right-size it for them, for their industries, for what they had lost over the past 3-4 decades to NAFTA.
Yeah, a lot of people in Pennsylvania are a lot more sophisticated than maybe some Washington politicians give them credit for. They're done crying over the steel industry. I'm from a steel family. My dad was 30 years in the industry. There's a lot of misplaced nostalgia. We see it in the Pittsburgh area where there's opposition to Nippon Steel buying U.S. steel. Everybody understands a good deal. They're going to save steel plants in western Pennsylvania. But Washington politicians will tell you it's just the opposite. So we've seen it. But you go to places like Hershey, Pennsylvania, where they make 70 million chocolate kisses a day, which is a lot of loving, all wrapped in a very fine aluminum foil. They have to import that foil. The last steel keg manufacturer in Pennsylvania, we lost them during the last round of steel tariffs. They raised prices of steel. Domestic producers raised their prices. I mean, Pennsylvanians are smart. They're part of the global and integrated economy. So they get it, and they're worried about prices, and I think most of them understand this is inflationary, what's being proposed.
So I asked the top, what's it going to take for Republican lawmakers to start speaking out, for Wall Street folks to start speaking out publicly? I think for Republican lawmakers, it's going to be their constituents. But for Wall Street, let's play Wharton's Jeremy Siegel, who is generally an overall fan of Trump's economic policy. Here he is speaking to CNBC on Tuesday.
Do you think the people in Florida living off, the accumulated wealth that they've done in the last 10 years are going to be all excited about some plant that Trump saves in Erie, Pennsylvania for 300 jobs or 500 jobs? by the way, producing something that they could have brought cheaper without the tariffs beforehand. I mean, it just doesn't make sense. Don't forget, almost half the American public owns stock, if not directly, indirectly, through their 401ks, through their IRAs, through their pension funds. You have 180 million, 150 million people there. So, we're going to bring some manufacturing back to the U.S. How many jobs is that? Less than 0.1%?
The Wall Street Journal reports it's going to take some CEOs of the big banks a market fall of 20% or 40% for them to start speaking out. I want to go back to what Charlie said about nostalgia. And I think nostalgia is very powerful. Listen, I have nostalgia for the news business of 10 years ago, let alone 20 years ago. It's changed. It's changed a lot. Our industry is contracting. It's hard to take. So I understand this desire for people to hold on to what was once great for them. How do we get to a point in this country where we offer new and better opportunities, optimism for the future, so that they're not looking backward any longer and trying to take us back to a time that we can't get back to?
I think that's the key here, being honest with the American people, that we are never going to return to the exact same jobs, the exact same industry mix that we had in the 80s or the 70s or whatever period it is that Donald Trump is trying to revive. That's just demagogue talk. That's not going to happen. And that's okay. You have to take care of the people who are in transition, right? You're not going to get them back those jobs, but you need to give them various kinds of safety net support and training and other opportunities. And being honest about that and coming up with a real transition plan, that's the fix. It's not lying to them.
And that's the hard part.
That's the hard part. And look, in many cases, the jobs that we are nostalgic for were not always so great. I mean, a lot of these jobs in manufacturing and in coal mining led to a lot of physical health problems and black lung and various other things that we don't even talk about. So we shouldn't even be aiming, I think, to revive those kinds of jobs. We should be aiming to revive jobs or to create jobs in any event that help people, not necessarily requiring lots of postgraduate, education, but help people get a solid middle class lifestyle and safe working conditions.
And also tell them that their kids are going to do better.
Let's bring in Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut. He's a member of the Armed Services and Judiciary Committees and serves as a ranking member on the Committee on Veterans Affairs. But let's first talk, Senator, if we could. I mean, you also served as Attorney General in the state of Connecticut for a number of years, about this executive order essentially stripping Perkins Coie of security clearances needed to represent clients and limits the firm's access to government buildings. I mean, what do you make of this and what can be done?
Well, thank you, Mika, for having me on this very consequential day in the Congress. What I make of this action is it is the ultimate in autocratic attempts to chill advocacy and speech. And it's emblematic of what this administration is doing. The FCC is investigating NBC and CBS. It is taking action against free speech around the country. And this attack on a law firm because of its clients is fundamental to the destruction of our legal system that this administration seems bent on doing. It is a full frontal attack, as Mike just said, but it goes to the fairness of everyday legal proceedings in our country. If you want to be represented by a law firm and you're unpopular, or if you've committed a crime that seems heinous, even though you are innocent, you're going to have trouble finding a law firm under this kind of autocratic approach to punishing law firms simply because of who their clients are. And, the bedrock of our legal system is that people are entitled to representation, even if they're unpopular, even if the public believes they have committed a crime. And this kind of chilling, deadening effect is emblematic of what the administration is trying to do to our legal system, which is the wonder of the world. It is the reason why we are, in large part, an exceptional country. Everybody's equal under the law. Everybody gets to be represented by an attorney. And, Williams & Connolly has a reputation for being fearless and aggressive, going back to Ed Williams, who represented very unpopular clients. It's what we do. It's what I did when I was a lawyer in Connecticut. I was a prosecutor, U.S. attorney, and then attorney general. But I believed strongly in everybody having a right to counsel.
Senator, you talk about today being a consequential day in Congress. I assume you're referencing there the upcoming vote on whether or not the government could shut down. Can you help us understand where Senate Democrats are on this right now? Because there's an idea percolating that if Senate Democrats are given a vote on an amendment that would give a shorter clean CR to April, that's the preference here. You guys don't have the votes for that, but neither do Senate Republicans. So where does this go next?
Well, you're right on both counts that Republicans do not have the votes for a 6-month continuing resolution. And the reason is that they rammed through this measure in the House on a strictly partisan basis. Government funding ought to be bipartisan. And it's now a partisan hot mess because they lack the votes. And our April 11th CR, a clean CR, would give us the time we need to negotiate truly a bipartisan budget. And so we are united in favor of that April 11th CR, and I think it presents the best chance of our keeping the government open, which we all want to do. Nobody wants to shut down the government.
So, Senator Blumenthal, you unveiled a bill this week seeking to reinstate thousands of veterans who have been fired from federal jobs, as well as provide them with back pay. The Putting Veterans First Act of 2025 is the first legislation of its kind looking to remedy the layoffs at the Department of Veterans Affairs and other federal agencies carried out by Elon Musk's government efficiency panel. So tell us a little bit, please, Senator, about the bill, but also just more broadly, the impact you're seeing on veterans or your constituents by these cuts put in place at times seemingly haphazardly by Elon Musk and Doge.
We're seeing the unfolding real-life consequences of the cuts in funding, the freezes on hiring, and the terminations, the firings across the Veterans Administration. 2,400 already, another 80,000 targeted at a time when there are already 36,000 vacancies. Doctors, thousands of them, nurses, custodians, schedulers. And so the consequences of these additional cuts are that we're seeing surgeries postponed, the mental health crisis line calls unanswered. The real-life consequences are coming home. And this legislation would very simply restore all of those veterans across the board in federal agencies to their jobs and restore every one of those VA workers to the jobs they had in the VA. And what we've learned is there's no plan. You know, Mike Barnicle used the word cruelty earlier in the show. That's what we're seeing here. Cruelty, chaos, callousness toward our nation's heroes. And I'm hopeful we'll have bipartisan support. I'm going to be introducing this legislation with Democrats like Bernie Sanders and others on the VA committee. But I'm reaching out to Republicans because this cause should not be partisan. We have to stop the bleeding in the VA and put back some sense of fairness and equity to people who really have earned and deserve these kinds of benefits.
Democratic Senator Richard Blumenthal of Connecticut, as always, thank you for being on the show today.